tell you that I am a terrorist. Because the President of the United States said, you're either with me or you're with the terrorist. And I'm most certainly am not with him. You know, it's interesting to me that when those who think that overthrowing Saddam Hussein was a justified reason for the invasion of Iraq, and they talk about what happened during the years that he was Iraq's leader, they say Saddam killed, Saddam tortured. But when we talk about what happens in Iraq today, we don't say Blair kills and Bush tortures. You know, we break it down to the lowest common denominator. You know, we talk about the criminals who worked in Abu Ghraib. And President Bush has assured us that he's going to get to the bottom of the situation in Abu Ghraib. And I suggest he not get to the bottom of it, but that he get to the top of it. And he can start by looking in the mirror. You know, our children, and that's what they are, they're children. The average person joins the military when they're 18 years old. And over half the people in the United States military are 22 years of age and younger. And I don't know about you, but I was about the smartest I've ever been in my life when I was 18, right? You know, they promised that the military is a job training program. You know, and I was trained to direct artillery fire. So if any of you need that done in your business, please contact me. You know, they tell us that the military is some sort of glorified program to send you to college. So when you're 18 years old, you sit down and you make the plan for the rest of your life, right? What happens when you enlist is you put $100 a month into a fund from which you'll be able to withdraw, plus the government's money when you get out of the military. But the truth is, and what the recruiting sergeants don't tell you, is that 65% of the people who enlist in the military and who pay into that fund, not only do they never get any money from the government, they don't even get their own money back. When I got out of the military, I was married, I had 2 children, and I was in debt, and I had to go to work. And that's what happens. You know, if the recruiters and the president, you know, or the president and the prime minister are wise enough to fool us into re-electing them, they're certainly wise enough to fool these 17 and 18-year-old children, because in the United States you can enter active duty when you're 17. My son did. If they can fool all of us, they can certainly fool our children. You know, and unfortunately, as you have seen, there is no happy ending to this war. There is none. You know, if someone's mobile were to ring right now and it was Tony Blair saying, you folks down in Manchester are right, all the British soldiers are coming home tomorrow, and President Bush has an email waiting for me when I get back to where I'm staying, and he said the same thing, it wouldn't be a happy ending. Because the effects of what have happened in Fallujah, what have happened to the children of people in Britain, what happened to Gordon Gentle, what happened to the children of the people I work with, those effects will last for decades. And I know this because I grew up in a home with a man who was wounded physically and mentally in war. My father spent 2 years in Vietnam. And I grew up watching him on Sunday afternoons when we would sit and watch football games. He had rocket shrapnel down his leg. The rocket shrapnel is really small. It's about the size of your fingernail in a clipping. And when it embeds itself in your body, slowly through the years, it will work its way to your skin. And you'll get a little itch, and you'll start rubbing, and a little blood will start to flow. And then you pull that piece of shrapnel out of your leg. And for 10 years as a child, watching my father do that, that's what I grew up with. And it's nothing to compare with these kids in Fallujah are growing up with. You know, but it's the only dad I had. And the myths that you hear about veterans of wars, they're not myths, they're true. My father came back from that war and tried for 20 years to drink himself to death. He's been married 3 times. And today, 32 years after he came home from that war, it's still difficult to have a conversation with him where the war does not come up. I grew up living on military bases. And in military bases, the playgrounds are in the center. And I remember as a child during the Vietnam War playing on those playgrounds. And we all knew that car. And that car contained the chaplain and an officer who was coming into our housing development to drive to a house, to stop, to get out in the driveway, to walk to the front door, and to tell the people in that house that their husband, their father, was dead. And when we were kids on the playground and the older children would see that car, they'd tell everybody to run home. And you run home screaming and crying and hoping and praying that that car's not going to your house. And that's what we're doing in Great Britain, that's what we're doing in the United States, and 1,000-fold that's what we're doing in Iraq. And you want to talk about a crime against humanity? I live outside of Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And Fort Bragg has the 82nd Airborne Division, most of whom have served in Iraq, most of whom were stationed in Fallujah at the beginning of the occupation. Those were the soldiers who had a compound in a school in Fallujah, outside of which a protest happened, a protest of unarmed people, and they shot and killed 17 unarmed Fallujans. And from that day forward, there's been resistance in Fallujah. And people ask me, what do you think about the resistance? How do you speak to that? Because not only am I an activist who is privileged to be able to travel and speak to you, but I'm an organizer. I believe in working in my community with the people who live there to help stop this war. Because the people who live in my community, the 82nd Airborne, the U.S. Army Special Forces Command, which is the Green Berets, their wives, their children, everyone in my community is touched some way by the military. My wife's father is a retired sergeant major from the Army. He served 2 years in Vietnam, and he went to Grenada, and he went to Panama, and he went to Kuwait, and every imperialist adventure that happened in the 30 years that he served. How do you talk to people like that when you're an organizer and an activist, and how do you talk about the resistance? And while it probably isn't the most politically correct thing, and in fact I don't do it, I don't stand in rooms and shout, support the resistance. What I do is when I have an opportunity to talk to someone in a small group or face-to-face, we talk about the inevitability of the resistance. And whether we support the people in Fallujah or not, they're still going to resist. And when we sit down and we talk, if people were rolling tanks down the streets of our neighborhoods, of course we would do what's going on there. It's a no-brainer. And so it's not a difficult subject to breach when you have personal conversations. And even the soldiers themselves who have served in that country will tell you when you speak to them that what's happening in Iraq is a natural reaction to the occupation. But I have to tell you, being an anti-war organizer in a town full of 40,000 combat veterans can be interesting. And sometimes it can be frightening. I've received death threats from the moment that I began to speak out. My wife's had her car window shot out in our driveway. But you see, my son enlisted in the Army, in the Navy, in the summer of 2001. And the world was a different place in the summer of 2001 than what it is today. I hope you'll give me that. And when the war broke out, my son was one of the first people in active duty in the U.S. military to speak out against the war. And he didn't say anything especially radical. And he said, I think this war's about oil. And he said this to a reporter from the Associated Press. He said the war's about oil. And there may be 1% of the people in the world who disagree with him, maybe. And they're all from Texas and living in the White House. And he said, I don't think people should be dying in Iraq. And from those two statements, and literally for those two statements alone, made to a reporter and reported around the United States, the Navy charged him with disloyalty, which is a criminal offense. And they charged him, and they took him to trial, and they convicted him, and they demoted him. And today I stand in front of you, and I am proud to say that my son is a fugitive from the United States Navy, and he'll go to prison before he goes to Iraq. And I'm proud of him for that. Yeah. So what do we do? Well, we formed groups of military veterans called Veterans for Peace. And we formed a group called Military Families Speak Out that currently has over 2,000 members of military families across the United States. And we talk to the people in our communities. And what we say is, because they ask some legitimate questions that they deserve to have answered. And they'll say, Lou, don't you think you're hurting the morale of the guys in Iraq who's organizing? And that's a stupid question. Because, those of us in this room, those of us in the peace movement, we are not the ones who told the lies upon which this entire war is predicated. Yeah. We didn't say that, all right? They said that. We're not the ones who told the soldiers on the invasion force, like my buddy Mike here, you're going to be greeted as liberators. You'll be greeted at the border between Iraq and Kuwait with flowers and candy. Those of us in this room, we're not the ones who said that, and we know who did. We didn't do things to the soldiers' morale like privatize their mail service. When my father was in Vietnam in the late 1960s and we sent him letters and packages, they got there in 2 to 3 weeks. When I send letters and packages to my friends in Iraq, it takes 6 to 8 weeks. And you want to know why? Because Halliburton delivers the mail. We're not the ones who send the troops for 3 months and then tell them that 3 months is now 6 months, and 6 months is 9 months, and 9 months is a year and a half. I have friends who, when they finish their current deployment, will have been gone 32 out of the last 48 months. And you cannot ask a human being to continue to do that over and over. These people have children, they have wives, they have families, and you put them in that kind of stressful situation, and what you bring out is someone who used to be a human being. Because what they've become is they've become a product of a military machine that doesn't give a damn about what happens to them. So I don't think I'm hurting anyone's morale when I work to bring them home from that cesspool. And unfortunately, when you get involved in anti-war activism, politics come into play, and people will say, "Lou, I hear you, man, but isn't this just part of an anti-Bush agenda?" And I go, "Well, hell yeah." But we just had an election last month in the United States, and what we had 2 pro-war candidates to vote for. Don't be fooled into thinking that John Kerry was in any way an anti-war candidate. His plan for withdrawal was a 4-year process. And his plan for the military was to add an additional 40,000 troops. And get this, to deploy all 40,000 of those troops in another country. Because not only do we have troops in Afghanistan and Iraq and Great Britain, we have troops in a total of 120 countries around the world. And we're not imperialists? Give me a break. I'll read this statement. This is from John Kerry. "The extremists attacking our forces should know they will not succeed in dividing America, or in sapping American resolve, or in forcing the premature withdrawal of U.S. troops. Our country is committed to help the Iraqis build a stable, peaceful, and pluralistic society. No matter who is elected president in November, we will persevere in that mission." And because he said things like that, the person who got elected in November was George W. Bush. Yeah. The argument that we get sometimes from people on active duty and from families is, isn't this just a bunch of whining? Shouldn't you remember, we have an all-volunteer military, and the people who signed up, they have a gun in their head, and that is a legitimate question. But I tell you something, and it was addressed earlier, the conditions on the battlefields of the 21st century aren't just deadly, they're toxic. If depleted uranium was safe, they'd pave the parking lot of Parliament and Congress with it. In the United States, we're raised from birth to be patriotic. And it took me 35 years to figure out that patriotism is actually nationalism. I love my country. I don't have to love my government. And when I enlisted in the military, I did it because I did it out of a sense of obligation and duty. I joined the same military unit that my grandfather and my father had served in, and I was lied to. So what our troops volunteer for is something they have no idea. They have no concept of what's going to happen to them. And they want to serve their country, and they end up serving McDonnell Douglas and Raytheon and Boeing. And that's not what they signed up for. So they don't need to quit whining. They need to keep telling the truth. And people who say, Lou, I hear you, man, I hear you, but, if we bring the troops home, it's going to cause a catastrophe. You've seen a catastrophe tonight, and that's because the troops are there. If they were home, that wouldn't have happened. And I don't know how it is here. I heard some allusions to it earlier, but the people in the United States, we are terrified. And we're not terrified that Canada and Mexico are going to suddenly cross the borders. We're terrified of the boogeyman. And I tell you something, more people died last year of fish bones stuck in their throat than died from terrorism. So we need to declare